This week on Brian Ross Investigates. Locked up, American lawyer Steve Donziger went to the Amazon to help people there fight against a giant oil company.
The whole idea of this case was to go into court and use the rule of law to get justice for people who've been wronged, had their lands polluted by Chevron.
But now Donziger is in an American prison, convicted of contempt of court after refusing to turn over his files to the oil company.
Judge Kaplan's order was so broad that Chevron would have gotten access to all kinds of privileged information, sensitive information. It would have put the lives of my clients, I believe, in danger.
Donziger's imprisonment has sparked outrage around the world, and we'll talk with his lawyer about what happens next. Plus, the torture tales. For the first time, one of the detainees at Guantanamo has testified in public about the torture inflicted on him by the CIA.
It's the first time anybody has publicly heard a description of the torture. I mean, so that itself is a breakthrough.
His genuine sense of remorse, the vulnerability, the horror of the torture that he went through. So that is what surprised me.
And this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the choices made by the editors of Mediaite.
Basically, we need to stop being dicks and assuming that the unhoused are a collection of drug addict criminals who've chosen this life for themselves.
From the Law&Crime Trial Network, this is Brian Ross Investigates. Good evening, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to our friends on Facebook Live. I'm Brian Ross, joined as always by my colleague here at Law&Crime, Rhonda Schwartz. And Rhonda, we begin with the story of an American lawyer, Stephen Donziger, who tonight is in prison as a result of his efforts to help the people in the jungles of South America fight against a giant oil company they say destroyed their lands. Rhonda?
That's right, Brian. A federal judge here in New York said Donziger thumbed his nose at the judicial system in refusing to turn over his files and computers sought by Chevron. But his imprisonment has sparked international outrage, with a UN human rights group saying that U.S. courts should not have sent him to prison.
We're joined now by Ron Kuby, the New York lawyer who represented Stephen Donziger. Mr. Kuby, thank you for being here. Let me ask you for the beginning, how long will he be behind bars, and are there any legal steps remaining to get him out?
He was sentenced to 6 months. He served a little over a week of that, so he has another 170 or so days to remain in Danbury Federal Prison until he's released.
Are there any appeals left for that?
There are. His appeal is going to be heard by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals on November 30th. They'll make a decision, in their own good time, but he will have served a substantial chunk of his sentence before the legality of the prosecution is ever determined by an appeals court. We have requested that he be free on bail pending appeal. The district judge ruled that he was such a flight risk, he had to surrender within 24 hours of the Second Circuit denying his bail application. And of course, there was the irony of the flight risk driving himself to prison, as he did last week. And the only reason he had to go to prison was because the judge said he was a flight risk.
And you've talked to him. How are his spirits locked up behind bars?
His spirits are good. Steve is remarkably resilient. He wouldn't have been able to fight, Chevron and its corporatist tools for as long as he had without being resilient. Jail is obviously a new experience for him, but he's not in camp fed here. He's in a low security institution, which mostly means the other prisoners are all there for nonviolent offenses, but some of them are serving very long sentences. He's in dormitory style housing. There's 59 people crammed together in one room, people doing their laundry and hanging laundry on the pipes. And Stephen said it actually looked like some of the refugee camps that he visited and now he's a part of.
A question for you, Ron Kuby, from Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda?
So Chevron says that your client is a disbarred lawyer and that U.S. courts threw out the original judgment against them, saying it was obtained by fraud and bribery. So what do you say to them?
Well, I say that decision about fraud and bribery was made by one district court judge, Judge Kaplan, not by a jury. And Stephen wanted a jury. Chevron decided it did not want a jury. Judge Kaplan, it's hard to know whether he was handpicked by Chevron from the beginning or simply Chevron through its lawyers later got the case sent to him. Once it came to him, he hung onto it like a remora on a shark, stayed with it for a decade, and then brought these criminal contempt charges against Stephen Donziger. So if Chevron actually had a colorable case of fraud, they should have tried it to a jury.
Let me follow up on that in a moment, but first, let's take a look at one of the last interviews Mr. Donziger did before going to prison, talking with us here at Brian Ross Investigates.
Judge gave you the maximum sentence. She said you showed an astonishing lack of respect for the law and that you had been thumbing your nose, she said, at the judicial system for the last 7 years. And she said, now it's time to pay the piper. What do you say?
It's just not true. From my perspective, I have complied with the rule of law consistently for the last 30 years, fighting for the Ecuadorian indigenous peoples. I mean, the whole idea of this case was to go into court and use the rule of law to get justice for people who've been wronged, who've had their lands polluted by Chevron. What actually happened back in U.S. courts after the Ecuadorian courts won is Judge Kaplan, who appointed Judge Preska, issued a series of rulings that I challenged. I did what lawyers do. I appealed orders. I filed motions. And what Judge Preska did on Friday was shocking to me because she interpreted every single one of those challenges to his orders as disobedience to the rule of law.
This grew out of reportedly your refusal to turn over certain electronic devices, notes, documents to Chevron so they could further sue you. Why didn't you turn them over?
Thank you for asking that. I mean, that really is the gravamen of the dispute related to my detention. Basically what happened was, in my computer are all sorts of privileged documents and information, communications with my clients, communications with other attorneys. And I've never said I won't turn over my computer under a valid court order. Judge Kaplan's order was so broad that Chevron would have gotten access to all kinds of privileged information, sensitive information. It would have put the lives of my clients, I believe, in danger because they would have gotten all of their personal data, people down in Ecuador I'm talking about. So I appealed the order of Judge Kaplan, and while I was appealing the lawfulness of his order, he charged me with criminal contempt of court for not complying with the order I was appealing.
Mr. Donziger, you spent the last 2 years under house arrest. You've been disbarred in New York State as a lawyer. You're now facing 6 months in prison, but as your friends say, you keep smiling.
I can't really explain that. I am proud of the accomplishments of the people of Ecuador. This case is viable. A lot of people say, oh, you lost, you're in prison, your life must be miserable. And of course it's terrible to be locked up. But the reality is this is happening, Brian, in my view, because we've been successful. In other words, this is an historic achievement that indigenous peoples won a large pollution judgment against a major U.S. oil company, and the damage down there is undisputed. It's terrible. People are still suffering. So the fact that that accomplishment has happened gives me great satisfaction.
Are you prepared to spend 6 months in prison?
I don't want to go to prison. I want to continue my work. I think I've spent enough time detained in my home over 2 years for a misdemeanor, 4 times longer than the maximum sentence. But if I have to go to prison, obviously I'll go and I'll do the best I can with it.
So, Mr. Kuby, let me ask you, if he continues to refuse to turn over those files, could there be more charges against him? Could he be back in prison?
Well, that's an excellent question, Brian. And the answer is no one really knows. I mean, at this point, Chevron won their case in 2017. It was over. Instead of just being a good winner and taking the win, okay, you got a judge who ruled in your favor, you won, congratulations. Instead of taking the win, they went after Stephen personally on these sort of collateral matters that had nothing ultimately to do with the merits or demerits of the underlying case. And in the process of bullying him and burying him under all these documents and demands and various this Jenga-style tower of court orders, Stephen created a movement around himself and around his case. People started to take notice, and I think ultimately this is all backfired on Chevron. I mean, they have created a martyr among us that they didn't have to create just because they couldn't take the win, because they're so used to operating with utter impunity.
Ron Kuby, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I hope you'll come back with your client once he's released from prison.
Soon as I can fetch him, Brian, I will.
Coming up next, the torture tales. For the first time, one of the men tortured by the CIA in the so-called War on Terror speaks publicly about what he went through. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law and Crime Trial Network.
It was the video that shocked the nation. An unarmed black jogger, 25-year-old Ahmaud Arbery, gunned down in broad daylight. The three men charged will now stand trial. For live gavel-to-gavel coverage of the trial, subscribe to Law and Crime on YouTube TV today.
For the first time, one of the men tortured by the CIA in the wake of the 9/11 attacks has testified publicly about what he went through in those notorious black sites, secret prisons run by the CIA. Majid Khan, a suburban Baltimore high school graduate who became an al-Qaeda courier and was captured in Pakistan, testified for more than 2 hours in front of a military court at Guantanamo. He described in graphic detail the violence, sexual abuse, and humiliation he says the CIA interrogators inflicted on him. He said he was often tortured in a dark room, stripped naked and shackled. The more I cooperated, he said, the more I was tortured.
To get a better understanding of the significance of all this, we're joined by Karen Greenberg, who is the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham University School of Law, and Mark Dembaugh, who's a professor of law at Seton Hall University, who also represents 2 detainees currently held at Guantanamo. Mr. Dembaugh, let me start with you. What is the significance of Majid Khan's testimony about the torture that he suffered?
Well, it's the first time anybody has publicly heard a description of the torture. I mean, so that itself is a breakthrough. You know, at the beginning, the word torture was forbidden to be used in court, and then it was never supposed to be seen. This is a huge breakthrough. My client has sent out drawings of the torture, and that got a fair amount of attention. But what Majid did, showing the human being, the face of it, describing what it was like, was in fact just shaking for everybody, including the jury.
And Karen Greenberg, were you surprised by any of his testimony about the details of what he went through?
We've seen books written by detainees. We've seen movies. So I wasn't surprised by the details of it so much as by the tone of, this is what happened to me as a person struggling with the death of my mother, struggling with what I'd done wrong with al-Qaeda. So his genuine sense of remorse, the vulnerability, the horror of the torture that he went through. So that is what surprised me.
And Professor Dembaugh had quite an impact on the military jury.
Well, that's what the most remarkable thing of all, to actually have a jury send a note to the court asking for, in a sense, clemency or at least some sort of adjustment and recognition of his pain is quite a staggering thing. In fact, I think that will change the debate for the future. I don't think the prosecution can be confident that when it puts on witnesses who've been tortured, the jury will be appreciative of the prosecution's position. I mean, I think lots of evidence is now going to be inadmissible once this story comes out. After all, almost all their evidence is derived from torture similar to Majid's.
So what happens to those detainees if they can't use the evidence and they don't want to release them? Are they still in a legal limbo forever?
Well, the key words are forever, right? Clearly, they're in a legal limbo, and they always have been. I think lots of changes are happening at Guantanamo. I don't think it's an accident that lawyers are now moving to have their clients released because the war in Afghanistan is over, and the war with al-Qaeda has been won decade ago. So I think that the courts are going to start approving people for release, at least those not charged by military commission.
And Karen Greenberg, what is the effort now to shut down Guantanamo? 2 different administrations have pledged to do that. It still hasn't happened. What stands in the way of that?
Well, I agree with Mark. I think the movement towards closing Guantanamo is starting to happen. What stands in the way is actually the fact of torture. What stands in the way is the fact that it's almost impossible to mount these cases because the government has claimed under state secrets that much can't be revealed, and because evidence that is the result of torture cannot be used in a court proceeding. And so as a result, you've had proceedings that haven't really been able to get to the trial stage. And I think that as torture comes into the conversation inside the courtroom, which is what has happened here, it is going to change what's allowable and change what happens.
Professor Demba, as you were saying, the word torture was sort of banned by many administrations. At major news networks, they couldn't use the word, a big debate about it. Now even Supreme Court justices are just simply saying it's torture.
Right. The Guantanamo now stands for detaining people without charge who were tortured. Few are being charged, but Guantanamo, they recognized, the Senate Select Committee recognized America had tortured at least 119 people. Many of them have been through Guantanamo and been released. And I think the politics of it is changing so fast. I don't think the American people really care about keeping these people locked in Guantanamo. And I think a president who's ended the war in Afghanistan is probably well positioned to be able to close Guantanamo. So I'm quite optimistic for both of my clients.
I just want to focus on one thing that Professor Dembo said, which is that, President Obama got way ahead of his skis. He, on his second day of his presidency, I'm going to close Guantanamo.
And we then provide the process whereby Guantanamo will be closed no later than 1 year from now.
Biden isn't doing that. He's going about this in a very kind of quieter, procedural way. And so we don't actually know what arrangements are being made or what will be made, but 7 detainees have been cleared for release since he took office. I hope more are in the cadre of folks that can be cleared for release that aren't being held before military commissions.
Well, Professor Demba, finally, your client, Abu Zubaydah, if he were to be released, would he pose a threat to the United States? Is he so angry about what happened that he would try to seek some sort of revenge?
No, absolutely not. First of all, he never was considered America the enemy. He never attacked America, never proposed doing it. So he's in there because they made a mistake by the CIA. But having recognized that, that probably doesn't distinguish him from many people in there. But, the point that I think we really need to make is how angry the detainees are not. Nobody in Guantanamo or anywhere else can live with anger and rage for 20 years. If they'd been prosecuted in New York in 2008, we wouldn't even be talking about any of this. They'd been prosecuted, tried, perhaps sentenced, appealed, and all of those things, and it would be over. Instead, we're stuck in this process that's an embarrassment to American legal system for many, many reasons.
Professors Karen Greenberg and Mark Demba, thank you so much for being with us here tonight.
Okay, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Coming up next, this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with what the editors of Mediaite have to say about John Oliver. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law and Crime Trial Network. Time now for this week's winners and losers in the media, as chosen by the editors of Mediaite. And we're joined by Aidan McLaughlin, who is the editor-in-chief of Mediaite, which, like the Law and Crime Trial Network, is part of the Dan Abrams media empire. And Aidan, you're chosen for your winner this week, John Oliver, for his take on homelessness.
But the very first step here is a collective change of perceptions. Basically, we need to stop being dicks and assuming that the unhoused are a collection of drug addict criminals who've chosen this life for themselves instead of people suffering the inevitable consequences of gutted social programs and a nationwide divestment from affordable housing.
Aidan, pretty serious talk for a comedian.
That's right. John Oliver does this. He's obviously a very funny comedian, but on his HBO show, which airs on Sunday nights, he'll often do deep dives into pretty serious and meaty policy stuff. This week was the homelessness crisis in the United States, which I thought did a really good job of breaking down not just the obvious details of the crisis, but also how we perceive the homeless and how media covers them. I think one thing that gets lost in this debate about homelessness and the crisis in the United States is that we often descend into sort of culture war fights about this. Fox News, for example, will cover homelessness as this sort of evil plague on cities like San Francisco, a plague that exists because of feeble liberal governance. So I think taking a step back and looking at the crisis and trying to figure out a way that we can address it whilst treating homelessness like a problem for the people that are actually suffering for it is something that's worth doing. And that's something that John Oliver really drilled home. So I thought it was a really great episode of his show on Sunday night.
And Aidan, for the loser, you chose the White House correspondent for the Newsmax networks. Tell us about Emerald Robinson.
That's right. So Emerald Robinson is the White House correspondent for Newsmax. She claimed on Twitter this week, in a tweet that has now since been removed, that vaccines contain some sort of satanic tracker called luciferase. And it's this really dumb conspiracy theory that we traced back. It's been bouncing around the internet for months. Reuters actually fact-checked it a few months ago and found that none of the vaccines contain luciferase, which is a chemical compound and not a satanic tracker. It's not surprising that Robinson would tweet something like this. She's been a pretty consistent vaccine conspiracy theorist. What is surprising about this story is that Newsmax issued 2 lengthy statements condemning her and calling her claims false. So it's not a good day for any news person when their own network is issuing multiple statements rejecting their claims as utterly false. She has now also been suspended from Twitter. That just happened about an hour ago. So it has continued to be a bad week for Emerald Robinson.
And very quickly, is she still employed as the White House correspondent for Newsmax?
As far as I know, she's still at Newsmax, off Twitter, but still at Newsmax.
All right, well, fascinating. What a conspiracy theory to spin and then get rebuked by your own network. Aidan McLaughlin, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks.
And that's our program for tonight. Thank you all for joining us. And thanks to our great team here at the Law and Crime Network for getting us on the air and getting us off the air every single week.